They called her Admiral's Brat, like it was a rank lower than dirt. The nickname started as a mutter, then a joke, then a chant. By the time they had her lashed to the rusted fence out in the Mojave, the word had been ground down to just one syllable, spit like an insult. "Still think you're special, Brat?" Chief Petty Officer Logan Maddox leaned in close enough that Captain Riley Soren could feel the heat of his breath. His hand pressed against the rope cinched around her ribs, grinding the coarse fibers tighter into her bruised lungs. Behind him, 3 other instructors in tan flight suits and ball caps laughed, their silhouettes sharp in the late afternoon glare. A few SEAL candidates loitered farther back, pretending not to stare, stuck between fear and morbid curiosity. Riley didn't answer. Her wrists were pulled back and up, plastic cuffs digging into the ulna, shoulders screaming. The top strand of wire along the fence had cut into the back of her neck when they'd shoved her there. Warm blood slid under her collar in a thin, ticklish line. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. She just breathed. Slow. Precise. The way she'd been taught to breathe in places that officially did not exist. "Look at you," Maddox said, lifting his phone so the camera lens hovered inches from her face. Daddy's little Air Force princess in the big bad desert. Still waiting on a ride from the Pentagon? He moved the phone aside so only she could hear the next part. "Newsflash, Brat. Your SEAL boyfriend isn't dropping from the sky to rescue you. Nobody's coming." Riley met his eyes, and for the first time since this started, he flinched. Because what stared back at him was not the wide-eyed panic he expected. It wasn't outrage, either. It was something flat, patient, old. She'd spent 16 months in a training pipeline whose code name was never spoken outside of windowless rooms. She'd watched people tougher than any of these men break down in a sobbing exhaustion and still be told they hadn't given enough. She'd learned to slip past cameras and walk through crowds like a rumor. She'd learned how long a human body could hang from its own shoulders before ligaments failed. She knew exactly what was happening to her. She also knew something Maddox didn't. 14 miles away, in a low, nondescript building full of humming screens and stale coffee, someone was staring at a blue GPS that had just stopped moving in a place where it shouldn't be. And once that call got made, this little desert crucifixion was going to come apart in a way none of these men had planned for. The Bravo Range complex sat on the far edge of Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake. 20-odd miles of baked earth, scrub brush, and forgotten mock villages pockmarked with bullet impacts and blown-out windows. From the air, the cluster of cinder-block buildings and rusted towers looked like every other training site in the Southwest. Bland, sun-faded, anonymous. Which was exactly how the Navy liked it. Inside the perimeter, the heat had a weight to it. It pressed on you, settled into your clothes and lungs. By 1,000, the thermometer nailed to the side of the chow hall, read 108 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. The wind felt like a hairdryer. Captain Riley Soren stood at the edge of one of the dusty lanes, boots planted shoulder-width apart, tin uniforms sweat-darkened down the spine. She held a small black notebook against her thigh, but she wasn't writing. She just watched. 30 yards away, a line of SEAL candidates in sand-colored uniforms pushed tractor tires end over end down the hardpan. The tires bounced, wobbled, and slammed back to the ground with heavy thuds that echoed off the plywood mock-ups of Middle Eastern streets. "Move it, ladies!" Maddox's voice cut through the shimmer like a whip crack. "My grandma pushes faster than that, and she's been dead 10 years. He stalked back and forth in front of the candidates, his shadow carving a dark line over the dust. 6'3", thick through the shoulders, neck like a fire hydrant. His forearms were a sleeve of faded ink. Tridents, skulls, a compass rose warped by muscle. He wore the easy snarl of a man who had discovered power in other people's suffering. Riley watched him the way she watched the candidates. Calmly, without expression. Her gray-green eyes gave away nothing. Commander Elena Park, the 05 in charge of the Joint Training Program, had given her exactly one warning about him during the initial brief. "Logan Maddox has more resentment than judgment," Park had said, flipping through Riley's cover file. "He knows his curriculum cold. He also thinks hazing equals mentorship. Stay on the edges with that one." Riley had nodded. She'd met 100 variations of Maddox across 3 branches in 10 years. Different names, same engine. Men who mistook cruelty for toughness because kindness reminded them too much of the fathers they could never please. On paper, Captain Riley Soren was just another liaison officer. Air Force, 31, TACP background, 2 deployments. She'd been sent from Hurlburt Field to conduct a curriculum review of Bravo Range's Advanced Survival/Evasion program. Observe, take notes, make recommendations, go home. Nothing about that file hinted at the 16-month hole where her life had gone dark. That part lived in a different database, under a different name. The only visible trace of it was a small ink mark just below her left ribs. A minimalist raven, wings tucked, head turned back. People who'd never seen it thought it was just some artsy tattoo. People who knew what it meant didn't talk about it in hallways. Her first day at Bravo, someone had asked where she was from. She'd answered without thinking. My dad's Navy. We moved a lot. He retired as a flag at Norfolk. The word had spread faster than any briefing. Admiral's kid. Must be a soft ride. By dinner, ma'am had turned to ma'am, that mocking sing-song of enlisted men who decided you were not quite real. By the next morning, the name had stuck. Hey, Brat. One of the instructors called when she stopped near the obstacle course to jot a note. You need shade? We can grab an umbrella from the O Club. She didn't react. Ignoring it only made them try harder. The irony, which amused Riley on a cold, detached level, was that military brat was the truest thing they knew about her. She'd had more home addresses than birthdays. She could list aircraft tail numbers easier than the names of childhood friends. Her earliest memories were of her mother sitting on basement steps in base housing, folding laundry while the TV upstairs broadcast CNN coverage of some conflict or another. Her father, Rear Admiral Thomas Soren, had never raised his voice at her. He'd never raised a hand, either. He hadn't needed to. He owned his world by sheer gravity. When he walked into a room, grown men straightened. His approval was a currency so rare that even a small nod felt like winning a medal. Riley learned early that needing attention was weakness. The less you asked for, the more likely you would get tolerated. Silence became her first survival skill. By 12, she could pack a bag in 10 minutes, no complaints, ready for whatever new coast the Navy tossed her family toward. By 16, she could read a room faster than most adults. The rank, the power, the hidden barbs all laid out in posture and tone. By 18, she was tired of being in the orbit of decisions, but never making any. That was the year she walked into her father's study, stood at parade, rest in front of his desk, and told him she was applying to the Air Force Academy instead of Annapolis. He didn't look up from the stack of papers he was reading. All right, he said. You'll have to earn that one on your own. He said nothing else. No congratulations. No objection. But 3 weeks after she got her acceptance letter, she found a worn paperback on her pillow. Once an eagle, cover breaking at the spine. Inside the front flap, in his neat block printing, he'd written 2 lines. Don't become the wrong kind of officer. Dad, no signature. No, I'm proud of you. It was enough. Riley didn't set out to be special operations. Her first love was control, weather, artillery, the neat math of ordnance on target. Combat Control School appealed to her because it promised precision under chaos. Drop into nowhere, build an airfield out of a dirt strip and a radio. Make order where there was none. Combat Control School nearly killed her. Paraphysical standards were designed with failure in mind. They chiseled candidates down to whatever was underneath all the bravado. Riley discovered she did not have the biggest engine in the class. She did, however, have a bottomless well of stubbornness, inherited from a man who had crossed oceans without missing a single watch. In Afghanistan, attached to an ODA clearing compounds in a valley whose name never made the news, she sat in dust and static for 8 hours, talking aircraft onto targets one after another. Her knees went numb. Her throat turned raw from calling in 9 lines and corrections. Her world downsized to grid coordinates, friendly positions, kill boxes. It was there, in a lopsided mud compound, that she watched Sergeant Evan Walsh bleed out on a wool blanket. The IED under the third doorway hadn't been on anyone's intel chart. There was a shout, A white flash, a concussion that clapped her chest like a giant's hand. And then there was Walsh, supine, eyes huge and unblinking, half his right leg gone where a tourniquet should have been. Riley knew the textbook. High and tight, stop the bleed, call the bird. She did all of that. She talked the medevac in with a voice so calm the pilot later told her he assumed she was standing in an operations center, not kneeling in a growing puddle of someone else's life. Walsh died anyway. The next morning, she woke up with her hands still stained rusty brown, no matter how hard she'd scrubbed the night before. Something in her cracked, not loudly, not in dramatic fashion, just a hairline fracture. Months later, back in the States, a colonel with a poker face and no name tag called her into a windowless office and asked if she'd ever considered volunteering for something more selective. More selective than this? She'd asked dryly. His mouth twitched. This would make this, he tapped her combat controller patch, look like a warm-up lap. Think about it. She did. 2 weeks later, she signed a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to choke on and stepped into a process whose official designation was nothing more than an innocuous string of letters and numbers. Unofficially, candidates called it Glass Raven. They weren't sure if it was the name of the program or a warning. Glass, because if you cracked, you did not just break, you shattered. Raven, because the people who graduated learned to live on the edges of other people's battlefields, watching, collecting, cleaning up. 16 started her class. 5 finished. One of those 5 didn't make it to the actual mission set. They lost Lieutenant Jonah Keene on a mountainside during a winter movement in Utah. The exercise was supposed to be a simple infiltration. Skin suits, skis, rucks, sensors. Somebody had miscalculated the avalanche forecast. The slope gave way so fast no one had time to shout. Snow poured over them in a roiling white wave. Riley tumbled, flipped, felt her legs wrenched in a direction legs were not meant to go. When it settled, she was pinned to her waist, chest compressed, the world a muffled whiteness. They dug her out in 9 minutes. They found Keene 23 minutes later. His eyes were still open behind a crust of ice. The official incident report mentioned terrain misjudgment and adverse environmental variables. Riley wrote her own report in her head every night for a year. I should have seen it. I should have argued harder when he chose that line. I should have. Keene's last words before the slide weren't helpful. Relax, Soren. You worry too much. First rule out here, don't look scared. Ravens don't panic. They just watch. She'd watched him die. She never argued with instructors again. She learned, instead, how to record everything quietly, how to weaponize silence, how to remember. When Glass Raven finally pinned its invisible checkmark next to her name, she walked away with a skill set that would never appear in any bio, and a little black raven etched over her ribs, wings folded against its sides. The only people who ever saw it were medics and lovers. The medics never commented. The lovers didn't understand. Logan Maddox grew up on stories, not memories. His father, Master Chief Grant Maddox, had deployed so often that Logan knew him better as a collection of framed photographs than as a living person. There was the young version, bronzed and grinning with a bell in the background, arms over the shoulders of other shirtless SEALs. There was the older version, jaw thicker, eyes more hollow, standing at a podium next to an admiral at some ceremony. Where most kids heard bedtime stories about dragons, Logan heard about training days at Coronado. You ring that bell, you ring on your own grave, his father used to say, pointing at the picture. Pain's temporary. Quitting sticks. What the stories never mentioned was context, injuries, politics, the 1,000 random tragedies of the human body. In the narrative Logan grew up with, there were only 2 types of people, those who made it through Hell Week and those who didn't. He knew which one he was supposed to be. He made it to BUD/S at 21, strong, fueled by protein shakes and a desperation to become a name on somebody else's wall. He muscled through Indoc. He gutted through first phase. And then, 3 days into Hell Week, his right knee swelled to the size of a grapefruit. He told no one for 12 hours. He dragged his leg up and down the beach, past the instructor's watchful eyes. He did push-ups with teeth gritted until his vision tunneled. It wasn't enough. His knee buckled under him during a log PT evolution. though it slammed into his head. He went down. The medics pulled him off the line. He screamed at them to let him stay. They ignored him. The MRI showed a partial tear. Not catastrophic, not career-ending, just enough. The board offered him a rollback to the next class. His father didn't call when he heard. Logan waited 3 days and made the call himself. On the other end, there was a silence that felt like space. "You had one job," Grant Maddox said finally. "Stay in the game." "You couldn't even do that." "It was my knee," Logan protested. "The doc." "Oh," his father said. "So that's your story. You're a victim now." He hung up. Logan declined the rollback. He told himself it was because he refused to be a pity case. He told everyone else that med would never clear him, that the injury was worse than the doc said. The truth sat heavy in his chest every morning when he woke up and realized there were no early swims, no logs, no paddles. Just a regular job in the regular Navy. He did a tour on a destroyer he hated, trapped inside steel corridors. The ocean always there and always a fence rather than a playground. Eventually, somebody noticed his PT scores and his knack for making other people move just a little bit faster out of sheer intimidation. He transferred into training command. Maddox discovered he liked being on the other side of the line. As an instructor at Bravo Range, he never got cold. He never missed a meal for a long overwatch. He never fell asleep standing up in freezing surf. Instead, he got to speak with his father's voice. Weakness disgusted him. Weakness in women enraged him. Because somewhere deep down, where he couldn't name it, he was terrified that if women could survive the pipeline he'd failed, then his excuses meant nothing. So when Captain Riley Soren walked onto his range, smaller than half his candidates, eyes too calm, with a last name that belonged on Pentagon directories, he'd felt something sharp and ugly twist in his gut. She was exactly the sort of officer he wanted to prove didn't belong. It started with a demo, middle of Riley's second day on site. Maddox wandered over between evolutions, wiping sweat off his forehead with a towel. "Captain," he said, a thin sheen of politeness over the word, "we've got a combatives block after lunch. You're welcome to observe, but curriculum review's always cleaner when you've actually felt it." Riley closed her notebook. "You're inviting me to participate." He shrugged theatrically. "If you're up for it." "Totally voluntary, of course." "Of course," she echoed. Commander Park, watching from the shade of the range tower, gave a tiny shake of her head, almost imperceptible. Riley caught it. She stepped onto the mat anyway. The training bay smelled like mop water and rubber, the air cooler than outside but heavy with effort and ammonia. Maddox stood in the center and clapped his hand once. "All right, gents, treat today as a gift. Your guest evaluator has graciously offered to help demonstrate that technique doesn't care about size or rank." He gestured toward Riley. She stepped forward, barefoot in PT gear, hair pulled back. Her build was deceptive, 140 pounds, maybe all tendon and wiry muscle. There was a small pale scar along her left knee, just below the shorts hem. A memento from Utah. Ensign Vega, Maddox called. Front and center. The chosen candidate was 6'2", ex-linebacker, forearms veined, jaw clenched like he chewed rocks for breakfast. He blinked twice in surprise at being picked, then rolled his shoulders and stepped onto the mat. Maddox's voice lowered just enough. "Don't hurt her," he said. "Too much." There was a snicker from the sidelines. Riley angled her stance, hands up but relaxed, weight balanced over the balls of her feet. "You familiar with the drill, ma'am?" Maddox asked loudly, so everyone could hear. "This isn't point sparring. This is clinch and control. Take down, dominant position, disengage when I call it." Got it, Riley said. Ensign Vega lunged, eager to impress. He went for a double leg, head low, arms wide. Riley pivoted. His shoulder hit where she'd been a fraction of a second earlier. She caught his right wrist with her left hand, turned with the movement, stepped her hip across his line, and rotated. It was Judo 101. He was 230 pounds of momentum and gravity. The mat shook under his back. Before he could process it, she'd followed the motion, knee pinning his ribs, his captured wrist twisted behind his shoulder in a tight configuration that made his elbow joint scream. He froze. Maddox's eyes narrowed. Riley held the joint lock just long enough for the shock to register in Vega's brain. Oh, she really could snap this. Then she released and slid back to standing. Her breathing never changed. All right, Maddox said, voice too cheerful. Once more. The second time, Vega was angry. He came in with more caution, less opening. They clinched, arms scrabbling for leverage, sweat slicking their grips. Riley's smaller frame rolled with the pressure instead of resisting head-on. 20 seconds later, Vega was on his back again, this time with Riley's forearms snugged under his jaw, her hips low, her legs pinning his. Enough, Maddox barked. She let go and stood, offering Vega a hand up. He took it, cheeks flushed red, not from exertion, but from humiliation. Even so, he managed to mutter, "Nice move, ma'am." Riley nodded. She made the mistake of glancing toward Maddox. Their gazes locked. He smiled. There was no humor in it. That was when she knew. This wasn't about curriculum anymore. This was about ego. And men like Maddox never stopped at a single failed test. The little things came first. Her room's AC accidentally got shut off one afternoon while temperatures peaked outside. When she returned from the range, her quarters felt like a kiln. The digital thermostat blinked error codes she'd never seen. She opened the window and slept in the heat because complaining would be recorded as couldn't handle environmental discomfort. Her range notes, 3 days of meticulous observation, vanished briefly from her desk. They reappeared that night, neatly stacked, but pages 5 and 6 had been washed with coffee. The ink had blurred. Someone had put them back to let her know they could reach into her work whenever they wanted. In the chow hall, the line shifted away from her tray by half a step, subtle enough that no one could claim exclusion, obvious enough that she ate alone. A rumor floated through the candidate ranks that she wasn't really a controller at all, that she'd been given her slot because of who her father was, that she'd had an easy deployment where her toughest call had been whether to push paperwork or go to brunch. Riley might have laughed if it hadn't been so predictable. She'd lost count of how many women she'd seen treated like they were made of glass and stolen slots. Some broke under the pressure. Some turned brittle, sharp, dangerous to themselves and others. A few, very few, learned to convert that pressure into diamond-hard focus. Riley didn't argue. She ran. At 2200, when most of the base drifted toward cots and bunks, she laced up her shoes and hit the perimeter trail. The desert night smelled like dust and creosote, the stars torrential overhead. She ran until the knot of anger in her chest dissolved into simple effort. On the fourth night, Commander Park called her into the small office that served as the command post. "You're not obligated to put up with this," Park said, arms folded, dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense knot. "I can reassign Maddox or pull you out." Riley stood at ease, hands loosely clasped behind her back. "I appreciate that, ma'am," she said. "But if you reassign him, the story he tells isn't going to be, 'I made bad calls.' It'll be, 'Some Air Force brat got me fired.' That's going to land on every woman who shows up after me." Park studied her. "You're being set up," she said. "You know that, right? Men like Maddox escalate until something breaks. Usually it's not them." Riley lifted one shoulder. "Glass breaks. This isn't glass." Park's eyes flicked briefly to Riley's ribs, as if she could see the tattoo through her uniform. For a long moment, neither woman said anything. Then Park sighed. "One thing you should know," she said. "After a heat casualty last year, we instituted a secondary GPS tracking protocol. Every long-range evolution gets monitored in real time from here. Transponders ping every 30 seconds. If someone goes off the planned route or stops moving too long, it flags red on our boards." Riley raised an eyebrow. "Intrusive. It'd save a Marine's kidneys," Park said. "Given the vibe on this base right now, I'm glad we have it. You're not alone out there, no matter what Maddox thinks." Riley nodded. She heard what Park wasn't saying. "We're watching. We will have record." "You think he'll take it there?" Park asked quietly. "He needs to prove something," Riley said. "If he thinks humiliating me in front of candidates will buy him the respect he wants, then yes. He'll take it there." She didn't add, "And he's not going to get what he thinks he's getting." On the morning of day 5, Maddox gathered the candidates and instructors on the gravel square in front of the operations building. Riley was there with her notebook, sun already turning her skin hot under the uniform. Maddox's voice carried. Listen up. As part of this week's review, our distinguished guest, he gave a tiny bow in her direction, has generously agreed to run the advanced survival/evasion field evolution alongside the candidates. 48 hours. 6 checkpoints. No tents, no vehicles. You all know the drill. The only way out early is hitting your beacon. You hit it, we come get your crying butt, and everyone else gets a story for later. He smiled like a man offering a party favor. Commander Park's jaw tightened. Captain Soren? She asked, projecting her voice. You are under no obligation to. I'll do it, Riley said evenly. She met Park's gaze for 1 second. The commander nodded once, very small. Maddox's grin widened. Outstanding, he said. We'll drop you last, Captain. Give the candidates a head start. Wouldn't want them distracted by worrying about keeping up with you. There was a chuckle in the ranks. Riley didn't look at them. In the staging bay, she checked over the standard issue kit. 1 canteen, 1 laminated card with 6 grid coordinates, 1 whistle, 1 emergency beacon, 1 compass. No weapon. This was navigation and survival, not direct action. She turned the card in her hand, memorizing the numbers, the relative positions, the terrain features listed in small print below. Vantage Ridge, Dry Gulch, Old Quarry. Her brain built a map. The beacon was a dull gray cylinder with a rubberized button. She turned it over, reading the fine text. Transmit on activation. Use only in life-threatening emergency. Her thumb brushed the button. She slid it into the webbing pouch on her chest rig and secured the flap. Last chance to back out, Maddox said behind her. She didn't bother turning. Last chance to design a fair course, she said. But here we are. He chuckled. That bravado might work on your boys in blue, he said. Out here, we play a little rougher. She did look at him then. I know, she said quietly. For just a flicker, something passed between them, a recognition that he was underestimating her, and that she didn't actually care whether he continued to do so. It bothered him more than any shouted defiance would have. They flew her out in a rattling Greenhawk helicopter, the doors off, the wind tearing at her sleeves. The sun hadn't fully cleared the horizon yet. It painted the eastern sky in bands of pink that would have been beautiful if not for the knowledge that those same skies were going to turn merciless by noon. One by one, the candidates had been pushed out in pairs at predetermined coordinates. She'd watched them disembark, shoulders hunched under rucks, silhouettes shrinking to dots in the scrub. When it was her turn, the crew chief tapped her shoulder. You good, ma'am? He shouted over the rotors. Yeah, she nodded. He grinned, then sobered. Hey, some of us saw the tape of that combatives thing, he added, voice lower. You're not the one I'd bet against out here. She gave him a small, genuine smile. Appreciate it, she said, and stepped into the wind. Her boots hit hardpan. The helicopter lifted in a whirl of dust and noise, then dwindled. Silence settled. To her, the horizon and the first coordinate. She started walking. The first hours were math and sweat. She took a bearing, plotted a rough line against the terrain. The laminated card showed Vantage Ridge north-northwest, 11 kilometers. She kept the sun on her right shoulder and let the heat build slowly instead of sprinting and burning out. By mid-morning, her uniform was a second skin of damp fabric. Her canteen was half empty. The air shimmered over the ground, making distant rocks look like pools of water that vanished when she reached them. She kept going. At checkpoint 2, a weathered Joshua tree with a green-painted rock at its base. She took a 5-minute knee in the sliver of shade, forced herself to sip, not gulp. Checkpoint 3 sat on a low rise above a dry wash. Her legs were already heavy, lungs drawing in air that felt too thin. She checked her watch. She was ahead of the recommended pace. She slowed deliberately. This wasn't a race. It was attrition. Around noon, the breeze died completely. The sun became a weight between her shoulder blades. Her tongue felt like cotton. She found a trickle of water at checkpoint 4 in the narrow throat of a slot canyon, more mineral-tasting mud than proper flow, but enough to wet the inside of her mouth and refill the canteen with water she'd later purify. She sand-filtered what she could, swallowed against the metallic tang. She thought of Glass Raven Cadre shouting over whipping winds on a mountain. Your body is lying to you. It says it's done way before it is. You listen to it, or you listen to your training. You don't get both. She listened to the training. By evening, she'd hit 5 out of 6 coordinates. Her feet pulsed. Hot spots had become blisters, had become raw patches. Her shoulders burned under the straps. The world narrowed to the arc of her next step. She checked the card again. Checkpoint 6, Old Quarry. No other details. She studied the map in her head. Old Quarry meant man-made scar in the land. Depressions, cliffs, potential dead ground. She angled toward the faint teeth of darker rock rising from the surrounding flat. As she crested the last ridge, moving more from habit than conscious decision, she saw them. The quarry had been dug into the side of a low hill decades earlier. The equipment was gone. The bones of the place remained. Pale walls, rusted cable spools, a chain-link fence left to rot. Maddox and 3 instructors stood near the center of the scraped-out basin. They were not pretending to be OPFER. No face paint, no Miles gear, no scenario props. Just flight suits, sunglasses, and an attitude. 2 SEAL candidates lounged on a rock outcropping to the right, their body language saying they'd been told to stay back and keep their mouths shut. Riley descended the slope with careful steps, ankles protesting the loose scree. She stopped just out of arm's reach. Checkpoint 6, she said. Nice of you to meet me. Maddox smiled. His teeth looked too white in the flat light. Technically, this isn't on the published route, he said. Think of this as supplemental training. He nodded at her canteen. How'd the ride treat you, Brat? She rolled one shoulder, shifting the weight of her pack. I'm still walking, she said. You wanted feedback on whether the course hits the limits of human endurance? It's tough, but survivable. I'll put it in the report. Something flickered in his eyes at the word report. This isn't about paperwork, he said. This is about reality. About whether an officer who's had everything handed to her can function when it's not a controlled environment. You designed this environment, she said, quiet enough that only he could hear. That makes it about control. He stepped closer. You think you're untouchable, he murmured. Because of your last name. Because whatever spooky little club you're part of thinks you're hot stuff. Out here, you're just meat, Captain. Out here, you can't hide behind. He stopped, because she'd let her gaze drift deliberately past his shoulder to the SEAL candidates on the rock. Both young, both watching, both suddenly looking less amused than uncomfortable. Maddox's jaw tightened. He raised his voice. Final evolution, Captain. Here's the scenario. You've been moving alone for 24 hours. You're dehydrated, tired, hungry. You think you're about to be X-filled. Instead, you get rolled up. You're going to fight or fold. She didn't like the look in his eyes. She didn't like the way the other instructors were spreading out, their hands flexing. The smart move, the by-the-book move, would have been to hit the beacon right then. To force the evolution into official oversight. To let the ops center see that their instructors were staging something off-script. Instead, she stood her ground. Clarify rolled up. Chief, she said. We talking controlled strikes? Search and restraint? Because I'm not signing up for. He swung without warning. It wasn't a full haymaker. He wasn't that reckless. It was a palm heel strike to her chest, designed more to unbalance than to break. Years of training took over. She rotated with the impact, planted a hand on his arm, used his forward momentum to pull him past her, stepped in, elbowed toward his ribs. She caught him, but not cleanly. He grunted. The nearest instructor lunged at her from behind, arms wrapping around her shoulders, forearm sliding poorly toward her throat. She ducked her chin, shifted, kicked back with her heel, felt his shin give. He swore. The third man came low, tackling her around the thighs. Her left knee screamed as it compressed sideways. She went down. Dust exploded around them. For a few seconds, it was chaos, limbs and curses and grunts. Riley fought like a trapped cat, all leverage and angles, making them work for every inch. She landed a heel on someone's instep, a fist against somebody else's ear. Her elbow jammed into a rib cage hard enough to steal breath. But there were 4 of them. She'd been walking in extreme heat for a day. Her muscles were depleted. Her reaction time a fraction slower than usual. Plastic cuffs ratcheted around her wrists, biting. A boot drove in her hip, flipping her onto her back. Maddox loomed over her, chest heaving, eyes bright with something that looked far too much like triumph. "Should have hit that beacon, Brat," he panted. He addressed the others. "Get her up." They dragged her to the fence. Metal rattled as her bound wrists were threaded over the top strand, ankles spread, shoulders wrenched into a painful hyperextension. The rough wires cut into the back of her neck when they shoved her chest first against the mesh. The taller of the instructors looped rope across her torso and around the fence posts, pulling it tight until her ribs compressed. Every breath hurt. Maddox stepped back, humming under his breath like this was a chore, not a crime. "A little field lesson in humility," he said. One of the other instructors hesitated. "Chief, this is a bit much, don't you think?" "It's training," Maddox snapped. "You think our enemies are going to give her a stern talking to and a counseling sheet?" She wanted realism. She's getting it. He pulled out his phone. "Let's see if Daddy still thinks she's ready for the big leagues when he sees this." He thumbed the camera on and walked back toward her, lens raised. "Smile, Brat," he said softly. "Say hi to the flag officers who bought you your shiny little career." Behind him, the SEAL candidates watched with waxy faces. One of them turned away. The other didn't. He locked eyes with Riley for a heartbeat, his expression a mix of guilt and apology. He didn't move to help. He didn't move at all. Riley filed his face away without judgment. People broke in different directions under pressure. Some stepped forward. Some froze. She wasn't here to test them. She was here to see how far Maddox would take this. Apparently, too far. Pain had a way of warping time. Minutes stretched, frayed. Riley's fingers tingled as the plastic cuffs compressed nerves. Her shoulders burned with a deep, grinding ache. The cut on her neck had stopped actively bleeding, but every shift reopened it, a small sting of warm dampness. The desert air baked her skin. Sweat dried almost as soon as it appeared, leaving salt crusts on her temple. Maddox and the others took turns taunting. The words blurred together. "Still tough, Brat. Bet the academy didn't prep you for this. Where's your fancy little secret squad now?" She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon. Breathe in for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Her mind slipped sideways, not out of her body, but into a place just behind it. She thought of Keen half buried in snow. She thought of Walsh's hand in hers, grip weakening. She thought of her father sitting in dress whites on a stage, expression unreadable as sailors in formation passed in review. You had one job, stay in the game. You couldn't even do that. That had been Maddox's father's verdict. Riley imagined him watching his son now. She wondered if he'd recognize himself. The rope cut deeper. Her breath shallowed. "How long you think you can keep this up?" Maddox murmured, leaning in so close she could feel his stubble scratch her temple. "You know, all it takes is one word. One little stop, and we're done. You get water, shade, maybe even some sympathy. That what you're waiting for, Brat? Mercy." She turned her head enough to see his eyes, even if it meant grinding the wire farther into her neck. "I'm waiting," she said softly, "for you to realize who's actually in danger here." He frowned. He didn't understand. That made it almost funny. Somewhere above and behind her, under the skin of the desert, signals were traveling. Small bursts of data shooting from the GPS embedded in her gear toward a quiet room full of screens. Her beacon might be untouched. The GPS wasn't. She'd counted in her head after they'd strung her up. 1 minute, 2, 3, 4. At 6 minutes, she knew the system would flag a stationary anomaly. At 10, the op center would escalate. At 15, if Commander Park was the woman Riley thought she was, somebody important's phone would ring. All she had to do was hold. That was the thing none of them seemed to grasp. They thought they were the ones testing. They were the ones being recorded. In the Bravo Range Operations Center, the air was cool and stale. Coffee cups formed a defensive line across the console. 2 petty officers sat in front of a bank of monitors, watching the usual slow ballet of moving dots, each candidate and instructor encoded as a different color, inching across the digital map of the desert. On most days, it was boring. Today, at minute 7 of Riley Soren's impromptu halt, the boredom cracked. Ma'am," one of the petty officers called out. Commander Park looked up from the training schedule on her tablet. What is it? Captain Soren's transponder just went static, he said. Off route. Not a checkpoint. About half a click north-northwest of Old Quarry. She's been stationary for 7 minutes, 38 seconds. Park stood. The room shifted. Zoom, she said, walking forward. The map obeyed, the blue dot sharpening against the grid. Any others near her? The petty officer swallowed. 4 green instructor signatures within 50 meters, he said. No candidates. They're moving around her. Give me their IDs. He tapped. Names populated on the side screen. Maddox. Hollis. Trent. Sims. Park's lips compressed into a flat line. Any beacon activation from Captain Soren? She asked. No, ma'am. Beacon's cold. She is too damn stubborn, Park muttered. She flicked her gaze to the clock on the wall. 15 minutes since the last scheduled radio check. She made a decision. Patch me through to the XO at China Lake, she said, and then to this number. She wrote a 10-digit string on the whiteboard from memory. The petty officer squinted. Ma'am, that's a DC area code. Correct, Park said. And before you ask, no, I'm not going to explain how I got it. 5 minutes later, a scrambled line in a secure office under the Pentagon lit up. The woman who answered wore civilian clothes but sat like a career officer. This is Morgan, she said. Morgan, this is Commander Elena Park at Bravo Range, Park said, moving to the corner of the ops center where conversations went to avoid casual ears. I was given this number with instructions to call in the event of any irregularities regarding Captain Riley Soren. I believe I have an irregularity. There was a pause. Define irregular, Morgan said. Park did, concisely, without editorializing. When she finished, the other woman breathed out through her nose. All right, Morgan said. You have a QRF on the ground? Closest Navy birds are 20 minutes out, Park said. We were told if this particular file ever went sideways, we might see someone else first. You will, Morgan said. Then what is she? Park asked before she could stop herself. Glass Raven. The silence stretched just long enough to answer the question. Commander, Morgan said finally, for the purposes of your documentation, Captain Soren is an Air Force officer conducting a curriculum review who has been subjected to unauthorized and abusive conduct by members of your training cadre. Whatever else she is not your burden. What is your burden is ensuring this doesn't get her killed before we arrive. Park nodded, even though Morgan couldn't see it. Yes, ma'am. And Commander? Morgan added. Yes. Thank you for calling. The line clicked. Park pivoted back to the console. All right, she said, voice hardening. Spin up the hello. Full SAR posture. Tell them they're going to have company in the air. And log everything. Back at the quarry, time had blurred into a gray smear. The sun lowered, shaving the edge off its cruelty. Shadows lengthened. Maddox had grown bored of monologues. His barbs came more sporadically now, less inventive, more reflexive. Riley's arms were tremoring from fatigue. Her fingers had gone numb. Pain had moved beyond sharp into a kind of dull, roar humming through her joints. She was just beginning to wonder if Park had been overridden, if politics back at the base had slowed the response beyond what her body could reasonably hold, when she heard it. A distant thump, more felt than heard at first. The instructors heard it too. Maddox straightened, squinting toward the horizon. Probably just the regular QRF drills, one of them muttered. Riley knew better. The rhythm was wrong. Too fast. Too low. The thump grew. Rotor wash hit the quarry seconds before the helicopter came into view, a sudden wind that sent dust swirling and rattled the fence against her back. A dark shape burst over the rim of the basin. MH-60, matte paint, no obvious markings. Not Navy standard gray. No big squadron insignia. It flared over the open area with a precision that screamed experience, downdraft blasting hats off heads and forcing everyone to shield their eyes. Shit, Hollis shouted, stumbling back. The helicopter didn't settle fully. It hovered in a partial skid, one landing gear touching the ground, the other a foot off, rotors still spinning hot. The side door slid open. 2 figures stepped out. One was Commander Park, hair whipped wild by the rotor wash, face like carved steel. The other was a man in a flight suit with no name tape, no rank insignia, just a small embroidered raven over his heart. He moved with the easy economy of someone who had been in too many bad places and survived them all. Maddox tried to speak, but the rotor noise swallowed his first attempt. He cupped his hands. "Commander, this is a controlled." Park walked right past him. She didn't spare him a glance. Her eyes locked on Riley. For the first time since the fence, something in Riley eased. Park stopped in front of her, jaw clenched so tight the muscles in her neck jumped. "Cut her down," she shouted. The anonymous man was already moving, knife out. He sliced the rope binding her to the fence with quick, precise motions. Another hand, she didn't see whose, snapped the plastic cuffs. Blood rushed back in her hands in a painful flood of pins and needles. She slid off the wire an inch, knees threatening to buckle. A palm pressed lightly at her shoulder. "You good?" the Raven Patch man asked, close enough now that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes. "I'll live," she said. She stood on her own power. Maddox surged forward. "Commander, with all due respect, this was an authorized seer adjunct." "Authorized by who?" Park snapped, whirling on him. Her voice carried even through the rotor thunder. "Because I sure as hell don't recall signing off on tying an officer to a fence in triple-digit heat with no oversight." Maddox spread his hands. "It's stress inoculation," he said. She agreed to the evolution. "Ask her." She didn't hit her beacon. She wanted the full experience. The man with the raven patch laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Oh, Chief," he said, "you really don't know who you've been playing games with, do you?" Maddox's eyes flicked to his patch. For the first time, he hesitated. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Park gestured to the helicopter. "Chief Petty Officer Maddox, you are to step away from Captain Soren and keep your hands visible," she said. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty pending investigation. Same applies to Hollis, Trent, Sims. Put your hands on your heads." "You can't do that," Maddox snapped. "You don't have the authority to." Actually, another voice cut in, cool and cultured. "She has all the authority she needs." And then some. Everyone turned. A third figure was disembarking from the helo. A woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair, wearing civilian clothes and aviator sunglasses. She moved with the quiet assurance of someone used to rooms full of generals. She walked toward them as if the rotor wash didn't exist. When she reached Maddox, she took off her sunglasses and studied him like a specimen. "I'm Director Alana Morgan," she said. "Office of Special Activities, Department of the Air Force. I'm here on behalf of a joint oversight panel. You won't find my office on your org chart." Maddox swallowed. Director, this is a naval training facility. With respect, your Captain Soren is assigned to my program," Morgan said, cutting him off. "Temporarily detailed here for curriculum review. Her presence on this base is contingent upon certain protections which you have egregiously violated." She turned to Park. "Commander, am I correct in understanding that this evolution was not on the approved training schedule?" "That is correct, ma'am," Park said. "There is no notation of an adjunct field stress test for Captain Soren, and no documentation authorizing physical restraint or humiliation." Morgan nodded. She looked back at Maddox. "Then here's what's going to happen," she said. "You and your colleagues are going to go. With the Master-at-Arms personnel currently boarding that second helicopter you probably didn't hear arrive. You're going to surrender your phones, your access cards, and any footage you took. You're going to answer some very pointed questions from people who do, in fact, outrank you in every way that matters. And in the process, you're going to learn precisely how unwise it was to lay hands on one of my operators." Maddox blinked. "You're what?" He looked past her, really seeing Riley for the first time. Her uniform was dusty, neck streaked with dried blood, hair blown loose from its knot. She should have looked small, broken. She didn't. She stood with the quiet poise of someone who had already been to worse places and come back carrying ghosts. Morgan didn't look away from Maddox as she spoke, but her words were clearly meant for everyone in the basin. "Captain Riley Soren," she said, "is a fully certified graduate of Glass Raven. Her clearance level is compartmented above TS/SCI. She has operated in denied areas on missions you will never be briefed on. She has been shot at by people who do not officially exist, in countries we're not officially in, and she has brought every one of her teammates home, except one. You, she jabbed a finger at Maddox, decided that such a person needed to be taught a lesson about humility. By stringing her up like a trophy in front of impressionable candidates and recording it on your personal device. The SEAL candidates on a rock looked like they'd been gut-punched. Maddox's face drained of color. No one told me, he stammered. Of course no one told you, Morgan said. That's the point. You don't get to know people like her exist. But you did get told multiple times about the boundaries of ethical training. You chose to cross them. She nodded at the newcomers in tan jumpsuits with security armbands who had moved in during the exchange. Take them, she said. Hollis lifted his hands, face ashen. Sims muttered a panicked string of "this is bullshit" that no one acknowledged. Trent stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as cuffs clicked around his wrists. Maddox stood rooted. He turned, finally, to Riley. His voice, when it came, was ragged. You could have hit the beacon, he said. You could have stopped it. She met his gaze. I knew it would stop, she said. Just not the way you thought. For a heartbeat, something nakedly human burned through his bravado. Confusion, shame, a dawning sense of proportions. He understood, finally, that he had not dominated a soft outsider. He had tortured someone who could have outlasted him, outrun him, and outthought him on his best day, and who had chosen instead to let his own actions damn him. The realization took his legs out from under him more than any strike could have. He sat down heavily in the dirt. No drama, no slow-motion collapse. Just a man suddenly too tired to stand under the weight of his own choices. The master-at-arms pulled him up and led him toward the second bird. Riley watched him go. She felt no triumph, only a small, distant sorrow for all the people who would have to clean up the damage he'd done before this, and the candidates who would have to unlearn what he'd taught them about leadership. Captain, Morgan said, attention shifting. Do you require medical evacuation? Riley rolled her shoulders carefully. Her neck stung. Her arms throbbed as circulation returned fully. I like a corpsman to look at my wrists and neck, she said. Otherwise, I'm functional. Good, Morgan said, because we have some paperwork to sign and a decision to make. Riley raised an eyebrow. A decision? Morgan's eyes softened just a fraction. Bravo Range just wrote itself into a stack of investigations, she said. Your original orders were to finish this review and return to Hurlburt for follow-on training. Given what I've seen, I'm prepared to offer you a different vector. But you don't have to decide now. Riley glanced at Park, at the basin, at the candidates still hovering uncertainly, absorbing the lesson that had just unfolded. One of them, Vega, the ex-linebacker, met her gaze and straightened unconsciously, as if standing in front of formation. Their eyes held. He gave a tiny nod of respect. She returned it. Then she looked back at Morgan. I'll think about it, she said. 3 months later, in a courtroom at Naval Base San Diego, Logan Maddox stood in dress blues that fit a little more loosely than they had at Bravo Range. The court-martial proceedings were not classified. The reasons behind some of Morgan's pointed questions were: Maddox faced charges of cruelty and maltreatment, assault, dereliction of duty, and conduct unbecoming. The videos recovered from his phone, and those of his colleagues were played frame by frame. The panel didn't need Morgan to explain what it meant that Captain Soren never cried, never begged, never activated her beacon. They saw enough in her eyes. When Maddox had a chance to speak, he said very little. He did not call character witnesses. His father sat in the back of the courtroom for 2 days, spine straight, jaw clenched, class ring glinting in the fluorescent light. He left before the sentencing. The verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence, dismissal and 8 years confinement. For a man whose identity had been built entirely on the idea of being hard enough, prison would be a furnace he might or might not emerge from reshaped. Hollis, Trent, and Sims accepted plea deals, other than honorable discharges, lost benefits, a permanent stain on their records. None of them would wear a uniform again. Their names filtered through the rumor mill of the special operations community, not as cautionary legends of toughness, but as footnotes in leadership courses about what happens when cruelty goes unchecked. At Bravo Range, training didn't stop. It never did, but the tone shifted. New instructors arrived, picked partially for their tactical competence, and partially for their emotional intelligence. Stress inoculation blocks got rewritten with input from psychologists and operators who'd actually been on the receiving end of real torture. And in a quiet file in a secure cabinet, Commander Park kept a recording labeled Soren Evolution Incident. She used it judiciously. When a young instructor in training suggested that things were getting too soft, ma'am, she invited him to her office, closed the door, played the footage, and watched his face. By the end, he no longer thought soft was the word he'd been looking for. 6 months after the quarry, Riley stood on a different range, on the opposite side of the continent. Marine Corps Base Quantico was all humid air and rich, dark soil, the trees exploding with green instead of the dun monotony of the desert. The advanced marksmanship field was a strip of mown grass leading out to targets at distances that made most infantrymen swallow. She lay prone on the firing line, cheek welded to the stock of an M110. The raven tattoo tugged slightly at her ribs as her chest expanded. On glass, she whispered out of habit, though there was no spotter. Her finger took up slack on the trigger. The rifle bucked gently. 800 meters out, a steel silhouette chimed. Behind her, a small group of candidates watched. This class was different from the one at Bravo. Some were Marines, some Air Force. A couple wore Army patches. There were 2 women. No one mentioned it. They all looked equally nervous. Remember, she said, rolling to her side to address them, this course isn't about who shoots the tightest group when the weather's perfect and your heart rate's low. It's about whether, when your body is screaming to quit and everything hurts, you can still do the simple things right. Breathe, align, press, repeat. One of the candidates, a young lieutenant with freckles and 2 new boots, raised a hand. Ma'am, is it true you're the one from that Bravo range thing? He blurted, then flushed. Sorry, that's what they said in the barracks. Riley regarded him for a moment. They say a lot of things in barracks, she said. Which thing did you hear? That an instructor tried to, and you just took it, until everyone above him showed up pissed enough to ruin careers. She almost smiled. That's a very poetic summary, she said. The reality is simpler. Someone abused authority. Someone else noticed and stopped it. The rest is paperwork. But why didn't you call it earlier? Another candidate asked. Why not hit your beacon? She thought of Maddox, of the sick gleam in his eyes, of the way he'd sagged when he realized who she really was. She thought of Walsh and Keene. My job, she said slowly, isn't just to survive bad situations. It's to make sure the truth of those situations can't be buried afterward. If I'd bailed early, the narrative would have been, she overreacted to a tough drill. By holding long enough for oversight systems to catch up, I gave the people who wanted to help me enough rope to pull on. She met each pair of eyes in turn. That doesn't mean you should always hold, she added. There's no valor in dying just to prove a point. Sometimes hitting that beacon is the bravest thing you can do. The trick is knowing which is which. A hand went up at the back. It was one of the women, a staff sergeant with tired eyes and the lean build of someone who'd already done too many ruck marches. How do you know? She asked. Which is which? Riley considered. You listen, she said. Not to the part of you that's afraid of looking weak. To the part that knows the difference between discomfort and danger. Between challenge and abuse. And if you can't tell in the moment, you talk about it afterward. With people who aren't invested in protecting their own ego. She thought of Commander Park's white-knuckled hand on the console. Of Morgan's dry, precise fury. Her father's old book, pages worn. She thought of the word brat, used like an insult by men who didn't understand what it meant to grow up always supposed to be strong, always watched, never allowed to crack. Also, she added, you look out for each other. Because if someone had stepped in at Bravo range before things reached that fence, a lot of careers could have been saved. Pure courage is rare. Cultivate it. The staff sergeant nodded. The young lieutenant digested the answer with the serious intensity of someone cataloging a plan for later. Load up, Riley said. We'll shoot until your shoulders ache and your group stop looking like shotgun patterns. Then we'll shoot some more. Questions later. They dropped to prone as one. She watched them settle behind their rifles, make small adjustments. As they fired in staggered rhythm, She glanced down at her ribs. The raven ink was invisible under her shirt, but she could feel it, a quiet reminder that cycles continued, that secrets lived under uniforms and inside stories, whispered and reshaped. Back at Bravo, new candidates were probably being told a version of her tale. Some would use it as proof that the system worked. Some would use it as warning that it could fail. Maddox, somewhere behind thick concrete and steel bars, would have hours and hours to think about the names he'd used as weapons, about the word Brat, and how it could mean strength honed by constant movement, not fragility. Her father had called once, weeks after the court-martial, his voice more rough than she remembered. "I saw your name in some briefings I wasn't supposed to see," he'd said. "You handled yourself." It was the longest sentence of praise he'd ever given her. She'd smiled into the phone, where he couldn't see. "Thank you, sir," she'd said. Now, as the last of the candidates' shots rang out and the range fell quiet, she stood. Targets in the distance were pocked with new holes, some close to center, some wild. "Not bad," she said. "Not good yet, but not bad. We'll get there. Slowly. Quietly. The right way." She slung her rifle and looked at the line of sweaty, flushed faces. Most of them would never know what glass raven really was. They didn't need to. What they needed to know was how to be the kind of people who, when a woman was tied to a fence in the desert and mocked as a brat, didn't look away. Because that was the part that had stunned every SEAL present that day at Bravo Range. Not the helicopter, not the secret clearance, not even the director dropping out of the sky like an avenging statistic. What shocked them was the realization that the smallest person in the basin had been the one holding the line for everyone else's conscience. Riley gathered them with a look. "Again," she said. They dropped to the ground. She lay prone beside them. Breathed. Aligned. Pressed. And somewhere deep in her chest, in a place scraped raw and then rebuilt by years no file would ever fully capture, something eased. Not because the world was suddenly fair, but because here for this moment, she could shape a better sliver of it. One slow trigger pull at a time.